got
recording.
subtitles.
So I'd like to formally welcome Piers Marquis. Piers is a Northamptonshire lad. He was born in Northampton many moons ago. I won't mention the date. So in Barrack Road Maternity Hospital, as I understand it. He went to Wellingborough School, and you can all boo now, boo. But his saving grace was that he was asked to leave, or the euphemism for being expelled, for anarchist activities. And this is you're very proud of this, aren't you? That you, Piers, that you were expelled from Wellingborough School.
I'm not ashamed of it anyway, that's for sure.
And you continued with your anarchist stroke libertarian socialist tradition since that time. You're the son of Jenny Lawrence, who many of us know. Oh, I know, but other people, I think Wilkie, you know Jenny, you knew Jenny as well, who was a local solicitor in Wellingborough, who did a lot of work, particularly in challenging racism and injustice in the Wellingborough area. And obviously you're a bit of a chip off the old block. So welcome, Piers. Piers's recent fame is in respect of representing Ricky Tomlinson in the recently successful appeal against his conviction in 1972 for his trade union activism as part of the Shrewsbury 24, who were convicted back in 1972 of organising, basically trying to organise the building trade and to stop the exploitation that was going on in the building trade at that time. You did I think the appeal, Piers, from France over Zoom, which wasn't ideal, but you nevertheless still won. Yeah. And obviously you'll be talking about that, and also I think your ongoing work to challenge the issue of the Reds Under the Bed TV programme, which was broadcast at that time and was significant in influencing potentially the outcome of that appeal, the outcome of their original cases back in 72. You're described by your chambers as a committed criminal defence barrister, best but not exclusively known for your defence of allegations of murder, terrorism, and offences related to serious organised crime. So I'm not going to say anything more against you because you've clearly got contacts, and I wouldn't want to step on the wrong side of you. You act as leading counsel, sole counsel, and junior counsel in cases of particularly serious or complex nature. And I understand, and you'll say something more about this later. The current ongoing cases of police undercover operations that took place against the left and environmental activists some years ago, and had long-term relationships, breaching people's human rights and their right to family life. Anyway, without further ado, Piers, over to you, talking about the implications of the recent victory of the Shrewsbury Pickets for the future of policing and criminal justice. So welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everybody else for coming as well. Just a little caveat before I start. I've been grafting really ridiculously hard for the last 5 months, so I'm pretty exhausted, and if I'm not up to full speed, please forgive me. Also, I'm an hour ahead of you here in France, and I always drink wine after 8 o'clock, so I am drinking while speaking to you. Forgive me. Good. That's all right. But so forgive me for that as well. So many of you will know much of the history of the Shrewsbury 24, but I'm going to give you a really swift breakdown on it. And then, as Paul says, kind of explain how it was that we won, more primarily where we lost, and then the implications for policing now, which you probably won't be surprised to hear will be a very, very short point. Historically, summer of 1972, building strike nationwide, protesting primarily for a decent wage. They were after £1 an hour on a 35-hour week. Health and safety was shocking on the sites in those days. There was an average of 1 death a day nationwide in the United Kingdom on the building sites. And also against the lump, which was a kind of subcontracted scab workforce in effect that was doing a lot of work throughout the summer. The strike was seriously effective, and as a result there was a lot of concern and upset amongst the corporate building trade, the large companies, and they were doing well. That will have an impact a little bit later in the story. But up in Shrewsbury and Telford, there were a number of sites that were still working. They were kind of predominantly lump, some union people who were just trying to work, but they were still working. And so on the 6th of September 72, 6 coachloads of pickets from North Wales, from Chester and some local went to the sites to picket them. There was undoubtedly disorder at some of those sites, but not so much that the police who were present throughout felt that they needed to arrest anybody. There were no arrests at all on the 6th of September. Within a week of those pickets ending, the strikers were successful. There were improvements made to health and safety. The wage went up, and there was some reduction in the lump to an extent. So all in all, successful strike. They didn't get everything that they wanted, but nevertheless, it was a pretty positive moment for the trade union movement. 5 months later, in February 73, 24 of the Shrewsbury Pickets were arrested and charged with various offences arising out of that disorder. In the intervening 5 months, there had been pressure put on the Home Secretary by at least one of the major construction companies in the United Kingdom. And obviously, there's always been a significant perception that the prosecution came about at least partly as a result of those corporate interests. The 24 stood trial. There were 3 trials actually over the next 12 months, and all of them were convicted. 6 of them went to prison. Desi Warren, who was the alleged ringleader of the pickets on the day, got a 3-year sentence. Ricky Tomlinson, my client Ricky, got 2 years in custody, and another one of my clients, Arthur Murray, he served 6 months for his time. So there were 6 of them in all that served. Before they were sentenced, Des Warren and Ricky Tomlinson spoke from the dock and said that this was a political trial, that it was politically motivated, and that the conspiracy to intimidate the workers had actually come from the bosses and the corporates. And in effect, this was what they called a political stitch-up. They served their time. There were a number of appeal processes over the years. None of them were successful, but 47 years later, they were finally proved right. We certainly say they were proved right in respect of it being a political stitch-up. The Court of Appeal obviously didn't go quite as far as that when they quashed the convictions, but they nevertheless did quash the convictions of all 24, well, of the 14 of the 24 pickets that applied, that actually appealed. This was obviously, although it was 47 years too late, it was obviously a great victory, not just for them and their families, but for all the support that they've had over the years, and for the unions as well. The reason, yeah, there they are. Very good to see. The reason that they won was because the Shrewsbury 24 campaign unearthed a load of documents from the National Archives, and using those documents, we were all able to show that, first of all, police officers had destroyed the first-hand accounts of witnesses at Shrewsbury and Telford en masse. The prosecution tried to argue that this was just a few statements that had gone, but that was just not even considered to be a viable rationale, even by the Court of Appeal. So the police destroyed first-hand statements en masse. The prosecution knew, and not just the prosecution barristers, but the DPP knew that these statements had been destroyed. They did not disclose any of this to any of the defence barristers or defendants at the time in any of the 3 trials. And worse than that, certainly in the first trial when Ricky and Des were convicted, they actually told the jury and the judge that the defence had everything that they were entitled to have and more, which was frankly, it was full-scale misleading of the court in effect. So the Court of Appeal ruled that the verdicts were unsafe, and they did it on that ground. That was our first ground. It was our first argument, because there were some 700 witnesses that provided statements. 200 of them gave evidence, and a significant number of those were destroyed, so that the defence weren't able to ask the sort of questions they would have wanted to ask. So huge credit to everyone that worked towards it. But we were, when I say we, my solicitors, the Public Interest Law Centre, and Ricky and Arthur, who are my clients, we were putting most of our efforts into arguing an alternative ground, an additional ground, which related to the Red Under the Bed documentary that Paul's referred to, that was shown during the trial. And it was our argument, in effect, that this documentary prejudiced the jury to such an extent that the trial could not have been fair in any event. But the real interest in that story is how the documentary was made, who was involved in making it, and how they utilised it to effectively ensure that these pickets were convicted. And the trade unions' victory that summer was tainted by these imprisonments, and effectively damaged them. There are many trade unionists who argue that the conviction of the Shrewsbury 24 was a significant damaging moment in the history of the strikes, full stop, in the early to mid 70s. So the Red Under the Bed documentary is the interesting thing, because the Court of Appeal said, well, you know, the police, in effect, I'm paraphrasing here, but in effect they said the police were bent, the prosecution didn't do what they should have done, and therefore these guys are innocent. But that's the micro perspective, but the macro perspective really shows corporate and state involvement in the prosecution of these innocent trade unionists throughout the proceedings, from prior to charge, to preliminary hearings, to trial, to sentence, and then realistically the scuppering of all appeals thereafter, because the state knew what had happened, and they never disclosed it. And but for the Shrewsbury 24 campaign, the documents would never have been uncovered. So anybody who thinks that political intervention in prosecutions is a conspiracy theory, and there are a number of people obviously around who do think that, really don't need to look any further than the prosecutor himself in this case. He was Queen's Counsel. He went on to become a High Court judge. He told the Criminal Cases Review Commission, when they were considering this appeal at first, he told them that the government had been directly involved in the case. So this is about as establishment a figure as you can get, saying to the CCRC, the Attorney General actually telephoned us and asked us to interfere in the sentencing process of these pickets. And when you have somebody of that status admitting to that level of state involvement as a starting point, you have to start thinking that this is all really rather serious. There's also no doubt that in October 72, So just after the events, but before the prosecutions, the National Federation of Building Trade Employers, they represented all of the bosses, all the major construction companies. They were putting pressure not just on the Home Secretary, but also on the local Chief Constable in West Mercia Police to ensure that there were prosecutions. All of these points that I'm making, by the way, are referenced in our grounds of appeal with all of the documentary references. If anybody wants to look at those at any point, go on to the Public Interest Law Centre's site and there'll be a link to the grounds. I'm not going to reference them in the course of this chat because it will take too long, but you can just rest assured that when I'm making factual assertions, they are document backed. The destruction of the statements wasn't just a couple of bobbies. It was a wide scale destruction over a significant period of time. We also know that the DPP was aware of that, because the note that dealt with the destruction was actually came from the DPP's own files and was put into the National Archives. So right from the outset, very arguably, one branch of the state knew that statements had been destroyed and sat on it for 47 years. The DPP's office had that information for every one of the 47 years. And, you know, they put it in the National Archives, but they didn't put it there flagged up for people to see. And but for the campaign, it would never have been unearthed. So those are the bookmarks around which I want you to look at, read under the bed, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. And I know that during the last public meeting we did on this, somebody put up a YouTube, the documentary. I don't have the link, but it can be found and you can watch it and then see whether or not you come to the same conclusions that we did. These were the days when there were only 3 TV channels. This programme was shown in the middle of the trial. It was the day the prosecution's case closed, just before the defendants were going to start giving evidence. It was shown at a time when everybody on the jury would have been watching it. You've got to remember that jurors don't get up as early as people that are working normally, because they start at 10 o'clock or 10:30. It would have been prime time telly for them at the time. And the Shrewsbury newspapers, where the trial was being heard, pitched it in their local TV spots, star spots. This is the programme for all of you to watch tonight. So it was big news back then, this programme, and it was shown right in the middle of the trial. The programme, bearing in mind it was national, it opened with scenes of Shrewsbury Crown Court. So the jurors in the trial are sitting there in Shrewsbury Crown Court, looking at the same building they're in on the telly in the evening. Outside of the court, in the footage, there were 800 police officers protecting the court from a crowd of trade unionists. In that crowd of trade unionists, 6 of the defendants were pictured, including Desi Warren and Ricky Tomlinson. The music over the it was almost like Jaws, actually, the intro tunes, that kind of something frightening is coming to you in the by way of these pickets. They were shown with the hammer and sickle flying above them. They were shown with various pieces of anti-socialist and anti-communist commentary, generally speaking. There is no doubt, certainly in our mind, that the jurors could have failed to recognise the defendants standing there in this crowd outside of that court. Now, of course, this day and age, this programme would never have been shown. You could never show a programme with defendants in it, castigating them and painting a false picture of them whilst the trial was going on. But that's exactly what happened here. There were then 18 minutes of character assassination of anybody who was involved in the strike action committees of the building strike in the summer of '72. and all 6 of the first defendants, including Desi and Ricky, were Strike Action Committee organisers. Then the programme concentrated, and this is where it gets really interesting, on a journalist called Simon Regan, who wrote for the News of the World. He claimed on the programme that he infiltrated the building strike as a flying picket. He claimed that he had seen crimes perpetrated by trade unionists and pickets across the board. And the allegations that he made in the programme were almost identical to the allegations that were made against the Shrewsbury 24. So they're sitting there, the jury, watching this journalist, telling them that he's been watching this all across the country, the same kind of behaviour. The programme ended with a discussion programme with Woodrow Wyatt, who was later became a confidant of Margaret Thatcher, speaking with a number of talking heads, but one of them was a Tory MP called Geoffrey Stuart Smith. And the programme ended with Stuart Smith saying, "The violence in the building strike was caused by the Building Workers' Charter, operating in defiance of union leadership, indulging in violence and flying pickets." And then the programme just ended. So the jury were getting Shrewsbury, these defendants, character assassination, allegations made that mirrored their own, all fully endorsed by government members of parliament at the time and by the television programme. The defendants were all involved with the Building Workers' Charter. I know that Sean mentioned this to me a little earlier before we all started, but they were all involved in it. And whilst they all ran their defence that any allegations of violence and intimidation had been grossly exaggerated and in some cases invented, the jury were given the clear impression that this kind of behaviour that was alleged to be going on all over the country. The real shocker, though, is that Simon Regan had fabricated those allegations. So he's sitting there in the middle of a TV show making allegations that subsequently were found to be false. And they were found to be false because in autumn of 72, he had run a series of articles making those allegations about the building strike pickets. And he particularly said that he had seen incidents of violence in Birmingham and Northamptonshire. So the government, the DPP, got in touch with the chief constables of Northampton County and Birmingham City and asked them to investigate these allegations that this journalist had made. And both of those police forces, independently of each other, concluded that the allegations that he had made had been fabricated. So 2 police forces independently saying that he, well, they are totally discrediting him in effect. But in February 73, when Woodrow Wyatt decided to make this programme, he approached an organisation called IRIS. They were a propaganda unit connected to the Foreign Office, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and another unit called the IRD, the Information Research Department. That was it was the IRD that was the covert branch of the Foreign Office. And he asked them, Woodrow Wyatt asked them for assistance in making this programme. So this was at exactly the time that the pickets were being arrested. Wyatt is contacting these branches of government and saying, can you help me make the programme? And so what they did, they provided Wyatt with a dossier of information, including the journalist Simon Regan. So it was the government that gave Regan to the programme makers. But bear in mind that the government already knew at that time, because 2 police officers had independently investigated it, they knew that Regan was a liar. So you have one branch of government knowing that Reagan fabricated the allegations, and yet you have other branches of government recommending that he be included in a programme that happens to be shown in the middle of the trial of the Shrewsbury Pickets. So unfortunately, we couldn't prove that the government had scheduled this programme for the middle of the Shrewsbury trial. We couldn't prove that. And realistically, that's the reason why we lost on that ground. Overall, it made no difference. We won the appeal. The appeal is won. The defendants were acquitted. But of course, we all have significant grounds to believe that this was, as Desi and Rick said, this was a state conspiracy to convict them. And so we've put the call out for anybody who may be able to assist us with independent broadcasting, scheduling, documentation, or anything from Anglia or Granada or Grampian who made and showed the programme. But we currently haven't found anything yet. We're doing that just to be bloody minded, to be frank, because it doesn't make any difference to the conviction. But Ricky and Arthur are certainly convinced, and in Des's memory, they're certainly convinced that there was a lot more to this than just some coppers destroying some statements. So in a nutshell, and it really is a nutshell, the details are there in our grounds, but in a nutshell, that's what happened. And Paul has asked me to speak on the implications of this victory for modern day policing, and sadly the answer to that is there are no implications for modern day policing, because there will be no legislation to prevent this kind of thing happening again. The police and the prosecution and the state will not change their methodology. So that sounds really rather negative, but there are three things that we hope will come out of the verdicts being quashed, apart from the obvious, which is these 24 men and their families being finally vindicated. But we hope, first of all, that everybody will see that this is an example of, and it really is, this is police malpractice, corporate interests, fake news, fabricated allegations of violence, the demonization of protesters. It's an indicator of the extent that government are prepared to go to suppress legitimate dissent. And all of that is remarkably current. And so we hope that people will look at this and say, well, hold on a minute, this is exactly what is going on today. And there are some people who say this kind of thing never goes on. This case is a classic example of exactly how much it goes on and the extent to which we say government will go to control the population. So that's the starting point. But the other thing that came out of it that we really hope will kind of inspire people is that this wasn't three judges deciding to agree with the arguments of some lawyers. You know, this victory was a victory for hundreds of people that have contributed to the campaigns over the years, and this could not have been done without the efforts of the campaigners, without the efforts of the researchers, and without the people who skipped dinner on a Friday night so they could contribute to the fighting fund. Those, you know, everybody who put effort into this has actually won a mighty victory, even though we didn't win on the ground that really would have shown everybody exactly what the state was up to. So it shows what people can do when they unite. It shows what people can do when they show some genuine solidarity. So that's kind of the positive note that I'd like to end on. And as I said, if you want any more details, first of all, feel free to ask some questions now. But obviously, the meat of all of that I've said is documentarily backed up on the Public Interest Law Centre's website. There you go.
Thank you very much, Piers.
Pleasure.
Excellent insight into historic and potential and actual modern day policing. I have no doubt. What you did say, I did ask you whether you could say something about the other trial that you're working on currently, which is the where the police systematically infiltrated the left. Could you say and environmental groups on a long-term basis? Could you say something about that trial, which is currently, I think you're suing the police, aren't you, or suing somebody?
It's not a suing, it's an inquiry. It's a public inquiry, the undercover policing inquiry that some of you will have seen. There was a lot of across the board media coverage in the early days. It's been hugely delayed, hugely postponed, and a lot of the media's lost interest as we get to the interesting points. So you'll really only see coverage now in the Morning Star and the Guardian. They're really the papers that are running most of it. But there's a lot of stuff happening online. There's a lot of stuff happening with the spy cops organisations that are showing a lot of what's going on. But it's the Ricky Tomlinson case tied in with all of this to a large extent anyway, because the inquiry is dealing with the infiltration of leftist movements between 1968 and 2009. In effect, the Metropolitan Police Special Branch set up this undercover unit to infiltrate leftist protesters and leftist protest movements. Their argument for doing that was to prevent public order issues. But there is now evidence coming out that actually a lot of the remit was MI5 based, preventing subversion, or what's supposed to be subversion. But we've seen, many of you will have heard of some of the key features, which is the sexual relationships that these officers embarked on with female activists on the left, obviously without them having the faintest idea that they were being sexually abused by a police officer. We also have the theft of dead children's identities, which the officers were doing more generally. But those two features are the sort of the key features that everybody can get enraged about. Well, probably not so far. I couldn't go so far as to say Daily Mail readers, but most people would get, quite enraged about those two issues. But we're looking at it really from the perspective of political policing. We had this in the last 2 weeks. We've had one of our clients give evidence, a guy called Richard Chesham, and we effectively managed to show through his evidence that this particular undercover police officer that infiltrated the movements he was associated with worked his way right up to the top and became the national convener of the Secretariat for the Troops Out movement back in 1975, and effectively was destabilizing the movement from within. Most of my clients are, well, they're all left-wing, because thousands of left-wing groups were infiltrated and only 3 right-wing groups were infiltrated. But my clients are a mixture of late 60s Maoists, independent Marxist group members, Youth Against Racism in Europe, Stop the War Coalition, Socialist Workers' Party, and this what is the Socialist Party now, including, many of you may know, because he was quite close to everybody in Northampton anyway, Dave Nellis, who was the Coventry MP back in the day, who only took a miner's wage, or the work of the wage of a skilled worker in Coventry, and gave all of his parliamentary salary to trade union movements. So yeah, I'm also representing him. We're concentrating on the political policing because, again, we're trying to establish, like we did with Ricky, or like we wanted to with Ricky, that there's state involvement in throwing leftist movements off track. One of the interesting things we've been working on recently is that we're dealing with the 1970s at the moment. The inquiry will run for another 5 years at least, but at the moment we're dealing with the 70s. And of course, we have wide-scale infiltration of the Socialist Workers' Party as an example. They had, I can't remember how many police officers overall, but more than 30 officers infiltrated the Socialist Workers' Party. And these are long-term deployments. They are undercover for 4 years, these cops, getting into relationships with activists. But whilst they were doing that, of course, the National Front in the late 70s was firebombing buildings, smashing Bengali shops in, beating up Socialist Workers' Party paper sellers, hospitalising them, Column 88, Combat 18, all of that business was going on. And of course, there was no infiltration of them at all. So we're asking questions as to why it was that they spent all of this taxpayers' money on effectively abusing people from the left. So two things are linked.
Piers, can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I've got Ricky's book here.
Yeah,
and it's a fantastic read. It really is. If anybody's not got a copy of it, get hold of a copy.
I'll nick yours, Richard.
You can borrow mine, Paul. Not a problem at all. You'll live around the corner, so that's fine. Can you just, because this hasn't been explained, I know, and most people know, most people on this chat will know, what were the actual charges that were levied against Ricky and the other fellas?
Well,
just for sort of basic. You always say about charges 101 or whatever.
Yeah. In the first trial, the 6 first defendants, which included Ricky and Des, were charged with conspiracy to intimidate workers. That was the first and most serious charge, and it was that they realistically got the prison sentences for. They were also charged with affray and unlawful assembly. So those were the 3. In the second and third trial, the prosecution did not pursue them for the conspiracy charge because they said that was the ringleaders. So the first 6 ringleaders, who were the ones that were allegedly conspiring to intimidate the pickets, the workers on the sites that were being picketed. So yeah, those are the counts.
Tony, you had a question.
Thank you.
No, not at this stage, thanks.
Okay, Sean, did you have a question?
Not at the moment, no.
Anybody have a question or comment or contribution to make?
Could I ask, Paul?
Well, Tony. Sorry, is that John? Who was that spoke just then?
That was me, Paul. It's Wilkie.
Oh, Wilkie, yeah. Wilkie, you go, and then Tony's had his hand up.
Yeah, really interesting, Piers. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thanks for the work you do. I seem to remember something when I was doing sociology back at school all that time ago. There was something about a mysterious government person that seemed to appear to get the Shrewsbury Pickets out of jail and then was never heard of again. Something called the Solicitor General or something.
Well, I think where you might be going with this is the Attorney General's trying to. I think this may be what you mean. The Attorney General tried to interfere in the sentencing process of the first 6 pickets, but interestingly, he tried to stop them from going to prison. Now, that is interesting because the government, having effectively prosecuted and ensured the conviction of some individuals, why would the Attorney General then try and prevent them from going to prison? And the answer to that, certainly as far as we're concerned, is that shortly prior to that, there'd been the case of the Pentonville Five, which was a load of dockers who were nicked and imprisoned for unlawful assembly. And there was almost a general strike over that. I mean, they marched through to Pentonville prison and, everybody was going out. And the government, our theory is that the government was so concerned that if the Shrewsbury Pickets went down, there would be another general strike. That they tried to intervene in the process to sort of curtail that issue. It didn't work, unfortunately. I think Wilkie, that's it. I think.
Yeah.
Oh, and so that's the point that the prosecution Queen's Counsel confirmed in his interview. He was 94 when he gave the interview, so I guess he didn't feel like he had a lot to lose at that point. And he told them, and it's, you know, a fully recorded interview. He said, yeah, the AG tried to nobble it.
Right. So,
yeah,
deathbed confession,
more or less. And he did die shortly after that, actually.
Thank you. It's really interesting.
Pleasure.
Tony?
I know this may be a rather unfair question and too big a question. But considering now going on from the 70s to the 80s, there's absolutely masses of evidence of state interference with the miners' dispute. As far as I'm aware, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there are many miners who are still seeking justice. They were fixed, they were framed, they were generally fitted up. What are the prospects? And I know this is the too big a question, but it seems to me logically, if we're opening up the state conspiracy into, you know, they got away with it in the 70s, didn't they?
Yep.
And they continued it. You could argue there's probably some continuity in the ways in which the state worked going on from the 70s into the 80s, and probably, as you say, by implication. What do you think are the prospects of the miners getting some justice?
Well, there have been calls for years, just taking Orgreave as an example, for an inquiry into what happened then, and the state response to that is well, there won't be an inquiry into that because there weren't any deaths. That's the standard answer. You know, not really taking into account the mass police violence and all of the implications afterwards for the people that were on strike and their families. So there won't be anything in respect of that. In respect of general infiltration, the NUM are represented in the current inquiry, the undercover policing inquiry. So we are, and I don't represent them, but I know the people that do, and there are a number of the unions that are represented actually, although not funded, but they will be looking at, and we're all trying, all of the non-state core participants in this inquiry are trying as hard as we can to work from the principle of solidarity, so sharing resources and sharing information. And we're certainly looking at the moment into the issue of blacklisting, which I know Sean mentioned a little bit earlier on as well. And that, of course, had an impact on a lot of the miners, as well as a lot of other, not just trade unionists, actually, people from all kinds of walks of life, where we are trying to uncover evidence to suggest that they were affected purely because they had a certain political perspective. Whether we'll get any justice from that, well, who knows? You know, we're the guy I mentioned earlier on, Richard Chesham, who was in the Troops Out movement, my client, he gave evidence 2 weeks ago, 5th of May. And one of the questions that he's seeking answers to is why it was that he was so highly educated and intelligent. You know, he got a very good degree from a very good university, went on to do a PhD, and never got a job in the whole of his career. You know, that it's difficult to argue that there's any real rationale for that, other than the fact that he was involved in the International Marxist Group. So he's just an example, but because of working with him, we are looking at as many examples as we can possibly find where we think there may have been a link to blacklisting. And the Blacklist Support Group are represented as well in the inquiry, and they will certainly be, well, they are. I know that Paul saw Dave Smith's contribution to the Ricky Tomlinson meeting we did the other day, and they're fighting very hard to try and get something out of that. So justice in terms of acknowledgement and proof, I think we may get somewhere. Justice in terms of compensating and preventing, they are probably forlorn hopes.
Thank you.
Does anybody else wish to say anything? Sean?
Yeah, thanks very much, Piers. It was very informative, and of course I've been following that as a daily reader of the Morning Star, reading all of that on a daily basis, and also the stuff that's going on now with the spy cops and the justice for the mine workers that Tony touched on. I've got a couple of building working charters here that I dug out. That I used to be secretary of the these are in the 80s when I was secretary. I was still at school when the strike was on, but we resurrected it in London in the 80s. And as I was saying before the meeting, Desi came along to a couple of our meetings in Doughty Street, just off London Bridge, which was called the London Joint Sites. And from that, we started a national organisation and resurrected the Building Workers Charter. And some of those people that were then in the 80s with us, they'd been involved in the strike and had been involved in the disputes. Just touching on the industrial side of it, though, I think it's often overlooked that the strike was not just, as you pointed out, Piers, it was not just about money. It was the ending of lump labour, and it was even. I'm just looking at the charter's 11 points. Campaign against lump labour and direct employment for all building workers. I mean, when you take that model of employment of lump labour, casualisation, because that wasn't nipped in the bud in the building industry, the forerunner of that model is now what we have as agency workers, as agency labour in industry. And in the town that I live in Corby, it's nearly impossible to get an unskilled job without going through an agency labour. And I've done a little bit of research a few years ago that Corby had 43 employment agencies of a population of, say, 60,000. Northampton, 4 times the size, had 20 employment agencies. So I'm just, these disputes are connected with the rampant lump labour in the construction industry. That model of employment practice could be moved to any industry. It took them a few years to cotton on to that, but they moved it, and it's just rampant now, agency labour. Yep. In fact, I think some of the agencies that exist now are used for laundering money. I just think that, like they say taxis or hairdressers or car washes are vehicles for laundering money. I think agency labour's employment agencies are as well, and especially in this town because it's just too many of them. But a comment on the construction industry itself. The construction industry, in my experience, is rotten from the top to the very bottom, from the directors to the foreman who gives the shout. And I've worked for subcontractors where they'd pay you in the pub and all the rest of it, you know what I mean? And it's disgraceful the way building workers have been treated over the years, and the decasualisation of it, the crocodile tears that you hear now from employers saying they haven't got the skills anymore. No wonder they haven't got the skills, because the casualisation and subcontracting and lump labour would not allow them to employ apprentices. And, I work with many people that have been blacklisted. They ended up on direct labour organisations in London. Great, absolutely fantastic people. And you touched on it, Piers. These people, they'll certainly be remembered by me. And I put an advert in the Morning Star the other day for a guy that I knew, Ian McDeason, but just ordinary people that fought all their lives. They were blacklisted. It affected their family. Absolutely brilliant campaign. It's not full-time officials, not general secretaries, but people that are involved in our movement and gave their lives for it. You know, we should always remember, in my view, the people that went before us, and you know, the sacrifices that they made. And then, you know, it's absolutely unbelievable. And I think we should always remember those people and be aware that, you know, this is still happening. This is still. I just looked at that chart, and foolishly, I looked at it and I wrote an article for it. And I put my name and address in it, and I thought, so the organisations that you're talking about, just looking at, yeah, that's it. We've got the fools give us his name and address, but that's not just me. That's happened with everyone. But the construction industry is rotten to the core, and in fact, unfortunately, some of the union officials were the very people, especially you talked about Woodrow Wyatt. He was part and parcel of the ETU so-called ballot rigging, when he teamed up with Catholic Action and people like that to undermine what was a fantastic union. Jack Hendy's father and the two Franks as well. So there's a long history. Our movement is riddled with informers sometimes, and we have to realise that.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Sean.
Interesting. John has just put something in the chat about Richard Chesham at the Socialist Society at Goldsmiths. So I'll mention that to him, John, when I next speak to Richard. He gave his evidence really well on the 5th, and you can actually watch it online. And he talks about the Socialist Society at Goldsmiths, so you might find it interesting to look at. You'll find it on the Undercover Police Inquiry's website for the 5th of May. But he also deals with the blacklisting, and of course that's the area, as Sean's just been saying, that we're hoping to get a lot more information about and open up.
Yeah, I'll have a look at that. Thank you.
Yeah, great guy, Richard.
Yeah.
Very genuine, and you know, when he gave evidence, you could tell that he was giving evidence from a position of integrity, and it was quite powerful, I think.
Could I ask a question at this point? Was the chance of suing whoever on behalf of all the people that have been affected, not only with the current public inquiry, but also Ricky and Des, and is there any outstanding civil actions for, because I mean, sometimes the only thing that the capitalist society understands is bloody money, and suing the arse off these bastards, it seems to me to be a legitimate objective. Is there any outstanding cases to do with suing them?
Well, that's not my area of law. I don't sue people. I just defend people. So I'm no expert on it, but I do know that there have been settlements for a number of the women from the Met Police have settled with a lot of women outside of court, and I don't know the extent to which they will or may not be settling with other people, but somehow I doubt there'll be a great deal of it. Anyway, when they've infiltrated thousands of organisations, or at least 1,000 left-wing organisations, and bearing in mind that every one of those organisations would have had a significant number of members, the exposure to this kind of undercover policing is something that I don't think any government could afford to pay anyway, realistically.
Paul, could I just
bankrupt the government?
I'm just thinking, Paul, of the people who come along to the ISW meetings, who's the mole?
Exactly. I'm beginning to wonder over the years. I knew when I worked at the National Union of Students in the 70s that the anti-apartheid. I worked very closely with the anti-apartheid movement, and we know that South African intelligence infiltrated the anti-apartheid movement and also were engaged in terrorist acts against it. They planted a bomb in the anti-apartheid offices, and certainly there were people that we suspected were both British and South African security moles within both NUS and the anti-apartheid movement.
Paul, the day that there is a bomb at an ISW meeting is the day that, frankly, I moved to Leicester or somewhere.
Well, I just don't think that ISW is significant enough to want to infiltrate, frankly, Richard.
You never know. You never know. I mean, that Wilkie fella, you know.
Yeah. Well, you never know. They're clever guys, these the undercover. What I do know, actually, Piers, is that Special Branch in Northamptonshire for a very short period did infiltrate Combat 18. That doesn't help your case really, but I know that because they had a cell in Wellingborough, and they used to meet at a local pub, and I was informed by the police that they had gone into it because they were seriously worried about racial attacks being carried out by them. But I don't know whether that's unique to Northamptonshire or not.
Well, it's not. It's nice to know. I mean, we know that in the 80s, the SDS started to infiltrate the National Front and started to infiltrate the League of St. George, which is a slightly more extremist version of the National Front, who were pretty extreme anyway. So we know there was some, but in terms of the level of infiltration and the resources put into that, it was insignificant.
It was part-time. It was the odd. They attended some odd meetings and stuff. They didn't do the serious kind of stuff long-term, year after year, that they were doing on the left.
Yeah.
But I did know that they did it because they, to be fair to the police, they did, in confidence, they did pass on intelligence to us at the Community Relations Council for a while.
Good. Well, that's nice to hear. It's nice to hear when they do things properly.
What I find kind of scary is that we're now discussing people infiltrating Combat 18 and absolute Nazi right-wing bombers. Are we thinking that's the equivalent of Wellingborough Independent Socialists, who frankly there's a few of us, we meet up in a pub once a month. We're not Combat 18. I mean, no. we might be I don't know, Combat 1917 or something, but
we made a point in our opening statement to the recent phase of the inquiry. We made the point that whilst there was a flat in New Cross in London that was burnt to the ground, and 11 young black people died in the fire, and there was a strong suggestion that it was a National Front firebombing, although it was never proved. But we made the point that while the police could have been investigating that significant issue, rather at the same time that they could have been investigating that, they were submitting reports to MI5 on Socialist Workers' Party babysitting rotas. I kid you not. That's a fact.
And they also infiltrated the Stephen Lawrence campaign, didn't they? And the Lawrence family. They put the Lawrence family under surveillance.
That will be coming up in phase 3, tranche 3 of the inquiry. Yeah, that's a really significant part of it.
Yeah, Chet, you got your hand up.
Yes, I was just curious. Was it recorded from the Northamptonshire Special Branch how many members of Combat 18 they had to sleep with?
Paul, that's for you. I haven't got a clue.
I don't have a clue either.
No,
I'm
just not imagining.
I hope on 1 or 2. Yeah.
I'm just not imagining Combat 18 was more than a bunch
information request,
spotty teenage wannabes and some very grumpy old gammons who I just wondered which police volunteered for that. I would imagine they go for the leftist groups because there's a little bit more
so Chet, can I just say, having lived in East London where Combat 18 was a real thing, I know we tend to treat Combat 18 as something just a meh, but having met some of them, I don't think you can pass them off as spotty teenagers.
No.
Some of them were serious. So serious. In the sort of people that if you met them at a skinhead gig or whatever, while the band might not have been anything to do with racism or whatever, there were people there, having lived there, who were really, really nasty people. I think dismissing Combat 18 as spotty teenagers is a bad move.
Would you say also, just out of interest, because they were kind of gone before I was much aware of politics, or at least I hope so. Would they be like a curated cross section of society? With
Combat 18?
Yes.
No, they were heavies. Combat 18 were the heavy Nazis.
Yeah.
And dangerous and violent.
Yeah.
Proper thugs.
And that's why they were actually engaged in heavy racial attacks in
actual, turning up to music gigs where, I mean, skinhead bands, nothing to do with racism or whatever, but Combat 18 would turn up and would practically hijack that kind of place, hijack that kind of gig. And Combat 18 were deeply, deeply nasty people, not just spotty teenagers.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm going to wind up. Tony has indicated he wants to speak. After Tony, I'm going to wind up this section of the meeting to enable Piers to. Dave, did you have your hand up? Yeah, Dave. So I'm going to take Tony, then Dave, then wind up, because it's now 9:30 in France. Piers has already had 3 or 4 glasses of wine already, and he's presumably now and he now wants to have something to eat, because I know the French don't eat until about 10 o'clock. So we're going to let you go, Piers, and but I'm going to take Tony now and then Dave Green to come in.
Yeah, just one local connection which might be worth noting is that that's coming up in this current inquiry is that the Findon vicar, what's his name, Richard Coles, let it be known in a biography of his, autobiography of a couple of years back, that his brother called, I can't remember, is he called Mark Coles? Another name, some first name not known. Anyway, the significance of this is this man was a deputy police commissioner. He's a Tory in Peterborough, and he was one of the Cambridge deputy commissioners. He was actually forced to resign because of the disclosures made at the inquiry. The Metropolitan Police compensated his victim, but he has always denied any responsibility. And as far as I know, he was still standing in the Peterborough Council at the recent elections. I'll check out whether he remains a councillor, but he is just 30 miles less than that down the road.
Yeah, I remember hearing about this actually, and I can't remember which one of the undercovers it was off the top of my head, but I do remember hearing the connection with a Findon vicar as well. I think the evidence part of that will be coming up in a later phase of the inquiry, but yeah, I do recall that connection.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Dave, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Piers, but it seems to me that the fact of state interference, conspiracy, blacklisting, it is a fact of life, and it's unlikely to be eradicated under capitalism, because the ruling class are not going to let their profits or system be seriously threatened. But I also think it's important to to realise, and perhaps most of us do, that it's not just these high-profile cases that sort of indicate what's going on, but it happens all the time in most big towns all around the country. In Northampton in the 70s, for instance, there was a spate of industrial struggles around engineering and the building trade, and I remember well, and it was proved later, the surveillance, the photography of people, the planting of microphones and bugs on picket lines. It happened in a dispute I was involved in at Blackwood on Engineering, where they bugged offices and the picket line, and there was intimidatory visiting from special branch, and then blacklisting of militants after the dispute. But it also happened in Northampton around the question of the Anti-Internment League and Troops Out, where people like Joe Gallagher, a well-known activist from Bletchley, was framed. Not only was he framed, but with the connivance of a pub landlord, where they booked the pub where the meetings took place. But when the trial happened, the police physically stopped us, you know, witnesses, friends, from going into the court. Yeah, so these things, if these things happened in Northampton, they happen everywhere. Yeah. And just as finish, I mean, Sean mentioned the question of collusion of union officials, some union officials with the police and some of these organisations like IRIS, IRD, and that has been shown to happen as well. One of the local well-known militants was Brian Higgins, who led a massive strike in Northampton where there was police interference. He was blacklisted for 25 years. Unfortunately, he died last year. So it seems to me that this, we need to be aware of this interstate interference and what the state can get up to, and it's very difficult to see exactly the answer to that and how we handle that. You know, it's we obviously have to be aware of it, but yeah, I just wondered if you had any ideas about how we work in that sort of situation. We don't want to get paranoid where we're scared to have meetings and discuss with people, but just wondered if you had any ideas on that.
I don't have any ideas on it. I just think that the process of publicising this kind of thing is a positive, simply because, you know, to an extent we are all preaching to the converted. You know, all of us here will have similar perspectives on that, as you've just said, Dave, because none of what you said surprises me at all. But the more people recognise this isn't some kind of mad conspiracy theory, the better, to start with, so that at least people can start looking around themselves, but also pressure in respect of inquiries like this, because one of the biggest worries for most of my clients in the inquiry is that this is going to make people paranoid. It's going to make them think, oh my God, have we got a mole here? Have we got a long-term copper? And that in itself is destabilizing. You know, that destabilizes the left as well. So avoidance of that kind of paranoia is obviously important. But one hopes, and I say this is not a forlorn hope, but it may just be a hope. I hope that the inquiry will introduce new regulations and new measures to make the kind of infiltration that has happened impossible to occur in the future. I say that as a hope, but we were calling for, as an example, in our first opening statement, for genuine community policing rather than this kind of statist political policing. I don't know, Dave, whether anything will come of it, but it's all about fighting, whether we win or not, isn't it, really?
Could I say on that note, that's I think a convenient moment to finish, and we know it's going to continue, that surveillance is going to continue, but as Piers has said, I think the only thing we can do, Dave, is to minimise it. They need to know that we're watching them. They're not just watching us, we're watching them as well. And And you know, we're not going to eliminate it, but we need to be careful. We need to show solidarity with each other, and the success of the campaign shows that in the end, justice can be done. It may take time, but in the end, justice can be seen to be done as well. And I'm going to finish on that. Yeah, it was a victory, and we shouldn't. Victories are few and far between, aren't they, these days? So we sometimes have to take comfort, but we can win. We can win, and we need to keep struggling, and hopefully we will abolish capitalism, Dave, and that's what but not in my lifetime, I'm sure, but maybe in
so